So I have a link. This is a bit.ly link to the presentation. All my presentations are at Makai, mattmakai.com. I also have all the source code for my website out there. So if you actually want to see, I created this with Deck.js, and I have a bunch of presentations that are out there with Impress.js as well. So if you want to create some interesting presentations, these are all pretty easy to use JavaScript frameworks for just creating slideshows. At Makai, I do hands-on development work about 80% of the time. I am primarily in Python and JavaScript, done Java, and Clojure is sort of my learning language. So hopefully Clinton can teach me more about Clojure as the months go on, because he is the Clojure expert. My current clients are Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, where I've been for about the past year. Motley Fool is the one that I actually just started on Monday. I'm helping them out for the next couple of months. And George Washington University I support on an ad hoc basis, all with Python Django development work. In particular, Heroku deployments we're doing at Motley Fool, so that's sort of where a lot of this presentation came from. But I'll also walk through an example project I have as well. This is the firm that I work for, Excella Consulting. And this is sort of an interesting thing about me. I'm doing this thing called Coding Across America, where I'm basically just going to travel to 30 cities starting in March and visit with tech companies and just kind of code a lot. So 30 cities, 5 months, meeting with tech companies, going to tech meetings. I have tech meetups. I'm speaking at like Memphis Python, so if you happen to be in Memphis at the end of March, I'll be speaking about some GitHub workflow type stuff. And really it's just to spend a lot of time in coffee shops and code and that sort of thing. And I have a whole blog for everything so that when I'm speaking to tech companies and ask them questions about what they like about their city, like, what do you like about starting a tech startup in Memphis or San Francisco or Seattle? And certainly there's some cities where there won't necessarily be people there that'll be doing tech startups. Like I'm going to some really small cities, but that'll be the majority of what the blog is about. So now, why are you guys here? I always start out with, what should you guys get out of this? We have probably about 17 minutes left, and I want you guys to actually leave this room with something, which is a little difficult because some of you guys have already worked with Heroku, and some of you are just going to be thinking about some more advanced stuff that you can do when you're trying to do your next Heroku deployment. I'll just kind of briefly go over what Heroku is, and then I'll give you a deployment demo with an actual project that is open source that I created over just sort of like a weekend side project. It also uses D3.js in case you're interested in visualization, data visualization, that sort of thing. Then I'll talk about build pipelines, which is basically what I'm setting up at the Motley Fool, and showing how we can deploy with a continuous integration environment, continuous deployment environment. And then I'll just give you some great resources. I really like to give resources at the end of a presentation so that when you're kind of just flipping back through it, there's just the best resources that I've found on the internet through all of my searching are just kind of distilled there for you. So Heroku, there's the Heroku logo. So I already asked who the Heroku users are, and so a lot of you have already sort of experimented with it. But what is Heroku? It's a platform as a service, and it's built on top of Amazon Web Services. So essentially what it is sort of this abstraction layer on top of Amazon Web Services. And it's this abstraction that basically takes away what you normally would work when you're working with Amazon Web Services, which would be like EC2 and S3, and you have all these different pieces kind of configured together. You can still use Amazon Web Services, but essentially it's trying to abstract away the computing part of it, so that instead of having to worry about what sort of, are you going to use a virtual private server or just do bare metal, what operating system do you want, what sort of services do you want installed, it tries to distill all that into an abstraction, and then you can add on services later. And then there's two key fundamental pieces to it. There's these things called dynos, which are essentially just web servers. If you think of it as like Nginx, under the covers it's like the Ubuntu server, and I'm actually not sure whether it's Apache or Nginx, basically just handling web requests. And so as your traffic scales up, you can increase the number of dynos to scale horizontally and serve more traffic. And then there's this concept called a worker, and a worker is basically something you take off of the queue and you're processing in the background. So let's say you have a celery job that just kind of processes things, like you have some sort of batch processing in the background. You would scale up the number of workers if you have too much stuff on your stack and you want to try to get it down to to nothing on the stack anymore. You just scale up the number of workers until you're done. And the idea behind Heroku is essentially it's providing you best practices that allow you to scale your app horizontally. So it forces you to scale your app horizontally by basically just creating, you have to create your app in a standard Django way, but by the way that it's deployed, with the way that you're interacting with the database and the way that you have to write your web handling requests, or the way you're handling web requests, it allows you to scale horizontally by scaling up the number of dynos and workers. So this is just a page for basically you can see how much, like if you need 3 web dynos and 2 worker dynos, how much it's going to cost you per month. Now that's actually if you're running at full capacity all month. So for example, if you're running a site that you know you get a lot of traffic between the hours of 9 to 5, you can just scale back in those other hours so that you don't have to use as much processing, and then it'll just bill you by the second.
Will it scale automatically?
So it will not scale automatically, but there are ways
so you have to go in and adjust your dyno number.
Yeah, so that's the basic setup, is just doing manual, basically manual scaling. But there's ways with like New Relic that you can basically analyze the amount of traffic that you're receiving, and then you can scale dynamically based on some sort of preset configuration. So I created this thing called Visualization Portfolio. Essentially, I was just kind of writing a weekend side project, and I'll just show it to you guys real quick. It's a pretty simple site. It's a pretty simple site where I was just kind of playing around with some D3.js visualization. So I created one that was like a Python topics tree, which is just a tree structure that, okay, I understand. It's basically just a tree structure. When people are like, hey, I'm trying to learn Python, I just like kind of send them this, and I'm like, here's some things that you should probably do. This is like the rough order in which you should learn different Python topics. So for example, just kind of like read about the philosophy of Python, like why is Python different from other languages? And then get into functions and objects and classes and you know, the Python enhancement proposals, those sorts of things, and kind of make your way across Python. So I have different visualizations here. The plan is ultimately to add a bunch more visualizations, so I have an entire portfolio, but I really just created this over a matter of a weekend and never really went back to it since then. But I have all the source code on GitHub, so you can see it right here, and you can kind of dive in. It's a whole Django app. So if you want to just take a look and kind of dive through how the D3 visualizations are created, or just how the Heroku app is deployed, it's all right there. So what I figured I would do real quick for the demo is just update something and then push it out. So what you can see on the actual website is I haven't updated the year, so it's 2012. And so if we go under the base and search for 2012, we can just change this to 2013. And then do a git add, git commit. And then I can just push, actually let me just show you git remote. So it's actually a little difficult to read. Okay. So we have these two Heroku remote repository, or we have a Heroku remote repository where essentially we push to that, and then that's what deploys our code. So when we do a git push Heroku master, what this is going to do is it's basically going to take any changes that were pushed up to it, and then it's going to redeploy the application. And since this was a pretty small change, it was a real quick transfer, and then it's collecting the static files. And actually the way that this is served up is I have the static files being served off a content delivery network, which is Amazon S3 with a CloudFront in front of it. And that's actually configured. You'll see that how that you configure that. It's a Heroku environment variable that you would configure when you're deploying the app. So now it says it's deployed. And then when we go in and refresh the page, we'll see that it has 2013. Any questions on that little simple app, Jen?
This might be a silly question. I haven't used Heroku before, but it looked like I saw messages about installing the Python runtime, stuff like that. Is it actually like setting up a new instance of something, installing your code into it, and then switching where the website was running to the new version?
Yeah, so I don't have a complete understanding of how exactly it's doing in the background, and you can read more about that on their site. But essentially, the way that I understand it is that it is taking, it takes your changes in Git, and then it looks for requirements.txt file, and then it's going to install those dependencies that have not been installed into a virtual environment, and then it's going to switch the new instance with the old instance. So it'll happen seamlessly where it gets pushed, where any new web requests that come in after the app has been deployed will then be served up and they'll receive that new content.
So you pay the same cost for deployment even if you make a silly little text change in
Oh,
your file?
you don't actually pay for deployment.
I meant in terms of time.
Yeah,
like,
so
it has to install the dependencies and all that
Right,
stuff.
well, if you have a crazy requirements file, and like
Yeah.
it's going to download
You're only
tons.
paying for
That
web
was
requests though, right?
What I was wondering, don't because I thought they packaged it up for distribution across your dynos, so if you
Yeah.
had like LXML in there, you wouldn't be paying 5 minutes of compile time times every dyno in the whole app. It would just be when it's built in the package.
yeah, I would not be surprised if that's it, and quite frankly, I'm not an expert. Actually, Clint, go ahead.
That's correct. That they package it once, and they also keep your previous installation. So it's packaged up as something called a slug that they then deploy. But they keep the build directory, so if you add a requirement, then it's going to have to install it. But if you don't change your requirements, like it runs pip install require, but it won't have to download any new ones because it sees that you have them all.
Yeah, Ross.
I'm glad Chris mentioned LXML. Do compiled extensions cause trouble?
In general, no. I haven't run into any issues with those. Chris, have you?
I haven't done more than play with Heroku, but my understanding from the colleagues I have, like I have Luke from Heroku who's done a ton of stuff, and I thought he's using LXML for everything.
Yeah, LXML doesn't have third-party dependencies.
Yeah,
I would guess
like,
anything works that just compiles.
I think would be, the big thing would be if you started needing like crazy C library things that aren't in the version of Ubuntu they're using.
And they actually have a program called build packs where you can make new ones in case there are dependencies that you require that can compile them from scratch.
I have one more.
Yeah.
Do users get a new session after the deploy?
I don't know, actually. I'm not sure about that.
It should.
It leaves the same database it sets up, right?
Right, so it would be the same.
Yeah.
session.
Oh, you know,
If you're
that's
storing
what
the
it
session
would
in the
be. That's what it would be
database,
based on. Yeah. So if you're using now, in this case, I actually don't have any user sessions because there is no like logging in for anything. But it would, if you're storing your sessions in the Postgres database at the back end, then that session is going to continue. So any logged in users are going to maintain their session. If you're storing it in Redis, same type of thing. So you wouldn't actually be flushing that for any reason.
One other question I had, because I noticed the initial requests at first were quite slow, and then after your deploy were slow. Isn't that the switch over between the idle app and then actually starting it and running it?
So that's a good point. So if you're only running a single dyno, you get a single dyno for free, and so that's what I run off of. But essentially, if you have not handled any web requests lately, and I'm not sure exactly what the timeout period is, they idle that down, and then it takes about 4 to 5 seconds in order to bring your app up again. Now, to avoid that, you run 2 dynos at the same time, and then it'll immediately handle that web request. So that's the lag time that you see when I actually hit the refresh button or I actually click the link.
They just figured it would run people thinking every request takes like 5 seconds.
Yeah. No, that's a really good point. Yeah. So if you don't want that, if your site's not getting hit regularly, and I believe there are some people who actually will ping their site regularly to keep it active.
I read that as a workaround.
They pinged him uptime probe.
Yeah, but essentially the Heroku, the way they would like you to handle it is run 2 dynos. Did the deployment demo. So let me just talk a little bit about build pipeline. So a sort of simplistic way of looking at this, what I just did was I just took my local repository to git push to Heroku. Now that's great for actually deploying, but my code change is not on GitHub right now. So the next thing that I would do is I would push to both GitHub and Heroku, right? But this seems kind of silly because then you're out of sync in the meantime when you're deploying from one to another. So the way that you would normally want to set up your build pipeline is, if you're thinking about it from a continuous delivery standpoint, even if you're just deploying to a test environment, is you would do a push to GitHub. And then GitHub would have a service hook that would tell your continuous integration server, like Jenkins, that the repository has changed. So pull those changes. So you do a git pull into the continuous integration server, where you do a build, you run your functional tests, and you would essentially do any sort of code coverage metrics, anything that you want there to ensure the quality of the code is up to snuff. And if you pass all of your tests, you pass all of your your code quality metrics, then you could do a git push to Heroku from the continuous integration server and actually do a deployment. Now, depending on whether you have a client or your company, they may be more comfortable with doing a git push to a test environment as opposed to production. But one great thing about Heroku is one of the best practices. It basically tags everything, and I think this is actually what Clinton was talking about with having the slugs and the builds. Is you can just do a rollback to the previous version. So every single time you do a push, it's versioned on Heroku. So if you have a problem, you can roll back immediately. I just want to show you real quick, this is an actual snapshot from a Jenkins build configuration. Don't strain too hard to read that, but this is essentially pulling right off of the page, and because I'll go into this in a minute. But basically, you install two plugins to Jenkins. One of them is a Git plugin, and so they can pull with Git repositories, and then the other one would be the GitHub integration. And so with GitHub integration, it adds certain features that allow you to integrate better with GitHub. So one of them is build when a change is pushed to GitHub. And that allows GitHub, when you actually have to set up GitHub so it has a service hook, you point it to your Jenkins installation, and then anytime there's a change to your repository, that service hook is going to allow Jenkins to know that code has been pushed out there. And then when you're doing your build, you can have certain steps. And so what this is, bring this up a little bit larger, is when a build is being done, it will go into the workspace, and a workspace has been defined as an environmental variable. And then it'll start the virtual environment, and then it'll activate that virtual environment, and then it'll install it'll upgrade distribute, and it'll install all of the requirements.txt files. This particular command was just because one of the requirements, one of the dependencies in the requirements.txt file was causing an issue because of the distribute version was earlier than it needed. So that's why it did the upgrade distribute beforehand. And then it does python manage.py Jenkins, and this is a specific Jenkins. It's basically a specific command with Python, with Django, which runs your unit tests, runs your unit and functional tests, and then produces, like if you hook in code quality metrics and that sort of thing, it'll produce all the output. Questions on that setup?
I
Yeah.
always have questions.
Sure, go for it.
Just to make sure I understand, all of this is before it hits Heroku, just as part of
Yeah,
the context.
exactly.
Okay.
So this is the way you would configure part of how you could configure Jenkins in order just to run all of your task suite and everything like that, to make sure that the build is actually going to pass. Because you wouldn't just want it to do like the build, you'd also want it to run all your functional tests and everything that's associated with that.
What does manage.py Jenkins do?
Yeah, so that's a specific. It's a specific dependency in the requirements.txt file, which is basically a Jenkins configuration for Django. And what that does is it provides easy hooks into working with Jenkins.
Are you using Django Jenkins, like the one on GitHub?
Yeah, exactly. I think that actually it is Django Jenkins, which allows the Jenkins command.
Yeah.
And then from there, you can add post-build commands. And so what the post-build command would generally do is that's when you would actually push to Heroku. So you could do something with Fabric beforehand if you wanted to actually push to like non-Heroku, or you can just write a quick script that will just do a git push out to Heroku from there. And the other thing, Ben actually pointed me to this the other day, was Circle CI, which is kind of interesting. And have any of you guys used Circle CI in this room? Okay, Jen, what's your and Ben, what have been your experiences with that?
With one project, it was awesome, and another, they've got a lot built in. So Heroku has OXML, Psycho PG2, all the stuff that you might need. Circle does that with a lot of the services, like they've got Postgres, PostJS, but they have PostJS 2. So if you're using Django 1.4 with GeoDjango, no luck. So you need 1.5. But otherwise, it was great. You can configure everything from a YAML file and do quite a bit.
Cool. What did you think, Jen?
It was awesome.
Yeah?
I figured everything out. I think all I had to do was move my requirements file because apparently I had it in a non-standard Django location.
Yeah.
I moved one file and that was it. It was awesome.
And that's going to be an issue with Heroku deployments as well, is you would have to have that requirements.txt file in the standard location, which would be the base directory of your
Yeah, and I had like a
repository.
requirements folder, but it was super
Yeah.
easy. They did a really nice job of just figuring out what kind of project you are and where
Yeah.
things should go and running your tests.
Very cool. Yeah, so I actually haven't checked out Circle CI, but on the recommendation, I'm going to definitely check it out soon. And Jenkins can be a pain in the butt to configure. I mean, at the end of the day, you have to get some virtual server stood up and then actually do the builds and stuff. But actually doing the setup can actually be kind of interesting to sort of understand your entire build process. So that's why I kind of recommend trying that route, at least to start out. These are some resources just to kind of leave you guys with. This developer's guide to Django apps on Heroku was pretty useful. It's basically just a guy talking about all the snafus that he kind of ran into when he was trying to do a Heroku deployment with a Django app. And he just kind of walks through each one of the potential issues you could run into. And then Heroku Hacker's Guide is actually a really great book that kind of goes into all sorts of different ways you can use Heroku. I've read the whole thing. It's actually like 120 something pages. It's a really great read if you're going to want to use Heroku for like a real production app. This is a site I'm working on called Full Stack Python, which is essentially talking about, it basically explains the entire stack of Python. So going from servers, operating system, different resources that would go along with that, all the way up through running your WSGI server and that sort of thing, and every resource that I've found across the internet that I've really benefited from. So that's something that I'm kind of writing now and then continuing to work on as I travel around the country. Getting started with Django on Heroku is just Heroku's introduction, and then I use Ubuntu 10.04 for pretty much everything. I've kind of used that for the last few years and just never kind of like moved off of it. And so I kind of wrote just like the bare minimum steps that you need in order to install the Heroku tool belt, because the instructions here actually left out a couple steps, at least last time I checked. All right, thanks guys. Any questions or anything like that at this point? Or I think we had plenty of questions throughout.
When Jenkins runs those tests, is that on like an EC2 instance or is that on Heroku?
Well, it's on. I set it up on a virtual private server, so I usually have like a Linode server that I use as like a build box, and then just that's what actually pulls the code. You wouldn't actually do that on Heroku. I'm not sure how you would actually if you actually could set up Jenkins on Heroku. That would be the one gotcha.
I've been trying to figure that out.
Yeah.
Haven't been able to.
Yeah, I've actually never looked into that before, whether it's possible.
I thought there were some crazy people doing Travis deploys to Travis CI sounds a lot like Circle CI there, and they hosted continuous integration. I thought somebody mentioned they were doing build straight to Heroku test.
Okay, Travis CI.
Yeah, but well, I mean, it's basically anything where you can install enough of the tool chain to say push this to Heroku and make that work. I mean, as long as you can come up with a secure way of having the keys that you need for that, you could.
Yeah, you really just need git push. Right?
Yeah, so I mean, it's basically, it comes down to how do you distribute the SSH key which is needed to do this.
Okay. Yeah, and then Jenkins, like, it pulls out like X units for code coverage and stuff. So
the thing Jenkins offers is it has plugins for everything that's been written in that space, just about.
Yeah,
so
sure.
you have JavaScript checks, you have Python checks, you have HTML checks. You can integrate any tool into that. There, the one other thing I was thinking might also be good is just remembering fundamentally Jenkins or Travis or I'm assuming Circle, it's running a shell command for you. So anything that you could express that way with some level of pain and suffering, you can make work.
Cool, thanks guys. And definitely take a look at my Coding Across America blog. I have comments on there, so if you have been to any of the cities, there's 30 cities, so chances are you guys have been to some of them. I'd love recommendations for cool coffee shops, cool places to check out, or if you have friends that are doing tech companies that would be interested in talking to someone from Washington, D.C. Cool, thanks guys.
Do you want the clicker?
Does it work really easily?
Yeah.
I can give it a try.
What
Is that the right dongle?
Oh yeah, it'd be fine.
Yeah,
Which
that's
one?
the only.
I'm not cool enough to, unfortunately, to
Yeah.
show off a new presentation tool.
The one thing is like we're set up for a certain age range Apple hardware.
Power.
Yeah.
It just does like left and right.
No, well, so our motors are still.
Yeah,
You shouldn't even need to do that. You should just
that was the one thing I was like, oh, we don't have the iMac here because we're playing B.
There is one in the back, actually.
Yep. Sweet. All right. Thank you. Yeah. So my name's Erik La Bianca. I work at a startup over in Georgetown called WiserTogether. We're out here trying to drive down the cost and improve the quality of healthcare by providing access to information to consumers. We use Django. Boring title, Django and Deployment Tips, Tricks, and Best Practices. After watching Matt's talk, actually, I think you can change the title of this to Why You Should Use Heroku. And you'll see why in a minute. So, I want you to come away with two things. First thing is, one, why you should use Heroku. And two, if you're going to do deployment, it's all about reproducibility. You got to be reproducible in order to get your developers spun up. You got to be reproducible in order to deploy, right? And so we're going to talk about some of the things that you got to think about to make a reproducible Django application. And I know a lot of you guys are working on pretty major apps. You probably run into some of these issues. If you're just getting started with Django, you may not have had the opportunity to realize all of these pitfalls and why this is important. So maybe we get to pick something new up. So your mission, should you choose to accept it, make your application run with one click, everywhere it counts, every single time. Now Heroku does this pretty much out of the box. Make your application run exactly the same way, everywhere it counts, every time. And prove that it's actually doing that. When your application gets complex, that's actually a really hard problem. Okay? So, steps. In order to do this, you got to have reproducible infrastructure. We'll go over a little bit of what that means. Unfortunately, that's not really Django, it's not really Python. This is like old-fashioned IT ops. And if you haven't read it and you're doing this, there's a great little book called the Visible Ops Handbook. It's about 100 pages, and it basically tells you everything you need to know about doing this right. Definitely recommend it if you're going to do infrastructure layer. Second thing is you got to have reproducible systems. So on top of your infrastructure, which is kind of your network, your hardware, whatever, you actually need to have an operating system and an application stack that are reproducible and that you can actually trust is going to be the same from over time. Finally, you actually need an application that's reproducible, and that's a little harder than it seems. Your dependencies need to be nailed down. You need to be able to reproduce your dependencies. You need reproducible configuration, and it needs to be portable between multiple environments. You need data reproducibility. You're going to have some data to do development. If it's a real large site, you're probably going to be running into too much data to put on your laptop kind of problems. You might also be running into I can't have the data problems. If you're in any sort of a PCI, SOX, HIPAA type of an environment, you can't have that data. There's a big, no production data in development. It's a clause and everybody loses their job if you don't follow it. So that's a tough one. And you got to have reproducible deployment. You want to be able to scale. You want to be able to come up again after a failure. You want to be able to spin up new devs. So we'll talk about all those things. So infrastructure. Not going to spend too much time on this, by the way. Raise your hand, jump in, yell, interrupt, whatever. Small group, everybody's friends. It's all good. So don't hesitate to stop me, even if I'm talking too fast. That's cool too. So systems. You got to think about, are you going to use virtual systems? Are you going to use physical systems? Power management. How are you going to actually flip the boxes on and off? That's actually a problem. You go to these data centers. I live out near Ashburn. I don't know if any of you guys have been out there in the data centers, but it's just like wall after wall after wall. Flipping the box on and off is actually a problem. You got to solve that. Think about it if you're running hardware. Console. You're going to have access to the console of the system so that you can install an operating system. Important thing. Backup and restore. You actually need to bring the metal back up. The network layer, you got load balancing, you got security, VLANs, performance. Performance of the network is actually an important thing. With gigabit, it's a lot less. Usually the problem shifts to your application stack, but again, problem you got to think about. Your system, you need a stable operating system. Matt said he's using Ubuntu 10.04. That's the LTS, right? Yep.
Red Hat Enterprise 5. 6 is starting to become an option now, CentOS. Honestly, if you're developing against the non-LTS releases of Ubuntu or Fedora,
I think you're crazy, but you can. But regardless of all that, you want a stable operating system so that when I spin up the box, I just started at your shop on Monday. When I spin it up, I want to have this. You need to have the same environment. Otherwise, you run into the proverbial works on my box, and I hate that one. So you need a stable operating system. You need to be able to reproduce your installation. On hardware, this used to be a hard problem. You'd have to use Kickstart installs and whatnot. With virtual systems, it's a lot easier. Typically, you just take a snapshot, but you need to do it. And again, if you don't, you're going to wish you had. Probably at a time when you don't have the time to figure it out. Configuration management. You probably don't want to bake everything into an image. You're probably going to need to know where's my DNS server, where's the database, what's the password, did it change, who's allowed to access this box. You need to think about how you're going to solve that problem. Configuration management tools are out there. There's an old one called CF Engine, kind of spun off Puppet. Chef came along a little later. It seems to be the new cool kid. There's some Python guys making something called Salt Stack that kind of tries to be in the same space. BCGF2 or something like that, another Python one. I use Puppet. We can get into a big argument about that. It's fun. It's a totally different tool space, and honestly, they're really complicated and a pain in the rear. So unless you're wanting to be a professional SA, use Heroku. Packaging. How are you going to get your dependencies out of the box? We started talking about that just a little bit earlier. How are you going to which when on pip install, but it wants to have the Postgres client libraries available. How are you going to get those Postgres client libraries on the box? Are they going to be the right ones? You got LXML2. It depends. I think it ships with a prepackaged libxml2, so that's a little bit of less of a problem. But what if you need something else that uses libxml2? As soon as you get into C land, the dependencies end up being a real pain in the rear. You're mentioning PostGIS. That's a whole can of worms with dependencies. So you need to be thinking about how you're going to get those things out there and make those reproducible. Application environment. What Python version are you using? 10.04 LTS is 2.6. Okay. So you want to use the new hotness on your Mac. What's your Mac got? It's got 2.7, probably. So you immediately have a potential for typing code into your box that isn't going to run on your server. So I always build my own Python. First thing, I deploy my own Python so I can run on 2.7. I got 2.7.2 on the box on the server. I got 2.7.2 on my Mac. Again, these details, but eventually they'll bite you in a bad place. Database. Maintaining database is a total pain in the rear. That's something Matt didn't actually talk about that Heroku does. I think they have the best, one click to spin up a Postgres database and make snapshots and backup. You have to pay for that. You don't get it with the free thing. I don't think. Or you get 10
there's a free one now.
Yeah.
But isn't it really, really limited?
It's like a 10,000 row limit.
Yeah, 10,000 rows. So it's great for a toy app. For a real app, you're probably going to pay them. But honestly, think about paying them because the whole thing about making snapshot restore for a database, scalability, failover, it sucks. It's really hard. So the big system engineering problem there. Caching. You're probably going to want a caching layer. Varnish, Squid. I don't know. Maybe there's something else cool kids are using for HTTP caching these days. And then object caching. With Django, it's usually memcached. Again, that's another service. You got to spin it up somewhere. How much memory are you going to get it? What box is it on? What's the IP address? Got to think about it. Queuing. All the cool kids are running Celery, right? You're going to use Redis, maybe RabbitMQ, something like that. Again, another service. Somebody's got to make sure that thing's started. Which version of it are you going to run? Is it in your development environment? Think about that one. SSL, pretty easy problem. Honestly, I just started using Cloudflare, and it's like click a button, and for $5, they'll give you all the SSL certs you want. So probably not a big problem. But SSL configuration, if you actually did enforce SSL, lots of little dots to connect along the way. So something to think about. Anyway, that's all the stack. This is the stuff you get for free with Heroku. Honestly, you don't have to think about any of this stuff if you use Heroku. So if you don't have a reason you can't, I would recommend considering using Heroku. Regardless of all that, moving into the actual Django world, what are the things you got to do? Well, you got an application. It's just code, right? What could go wrong? Well, probably not. So just use pip. Everybody uses pip now. Back in a few years ago, there was a little more competition. Pip versus virtualenv versus build out. And people run easy install. Now everybody uses pip. That's fine. Unfortunately, some people write their libraries and push into PyPI, and then they delete the old version. I don't know if you've ever run into that. You got a requirements file, it's got 143 in it, and 143 isn't available. Or PyPI goes down. Now they got mirrors, so I think it's a little better than it was a year ago. Actually, there's a really easy solution to that problem. I'd recommend you do it. Make a folder. I usually make it a Git submodule. download your stuff into it. There's a little tool called Basket that automates that. You can pip install Basket. Download your Django, and then you run your pip with this whole little incantation, no index file, find links, and then the path to your little cache. Now you're automatically getting all your dependencies from the same bits. You got Git revision control, Git integrity guarantees. You know that everybody's getting the same bits, because you don't really get that guarantee from PyPI. You're trusting that some upstream package author deployed the same thing. They're not going to delete the old one. So this is definitely a good +1 to add your requirements.txt. Configuration. I don't know how many of you people have fought a settings file before. Settings files are like, I mean, they're basically the Django application. There's nothing else that defines what the app is that's running other than the settings file. And unfortunately, the whole no logic rule is kind of tough to live with, at least I find. Because you tell you, oh, use the local settings file for your local settings. And you end up with stuff like this, right? You got two URLs, static URL, media URL. You both want them to point off to some CDN. And you want to plug that in once instead of twice, because otherwise you got to give people a whole list of all the 5 things they have to override in their local settings. So this is a little trick you can use, and there's actually 2 examples here. One, this is ripped straight from Heroku. This is, I think, Kenneth Reitz wrote that little library for Heroku, and it basically parses all of your 5 database settings out of a single string in an environment variable. Cool stuff. And you can use the same trick yourself. Just set an environment variable. So basically, you set a variable called Django base URL, which you would do something like, I mean, this is for running a run server, but you can stick it in your supervisor config or @d, whatever you want. And then you can import it into your config, and then you can use it, and you can build other paths based off of that. So you can use that to feed in all kinds of stuff, like, is this in dev mode or whatever. And the nice thing about doing it this way is that you've kind of documented what all the things are that are coming in from outside, rather than it becoming a free-for-all, people overriding stuff with your local settings. So I find for stuff that is meant to be configured, this type of a pattern is good. We actually use build-out right now to feed these values in, because it has a kind of a nice config parser, and we're using build-out. You can use config parser environment variables. Heroku's using environment variables, seems to work well for them, so definitely worth considering doing. Your database. Database is honestly, I think, the hardest part about really solving this problem well. And unfortunately, this one right here is where things are going to melt down, because Heroku gives you a great story for deploying a new app, right? It deploys a new one, throws away the old one, keeps the version in the little bundle file. Right? Well, if you write a migration that doesn't roll back right, you're pretty much out of luck. You're relying on a database snapshot restore. I don't think they're instant. But one thing you can do to make databases easier is fixtures. For your development environment, you're probably going to need some data. Maybe it's a business app, you've got company records. The default Django documentation tells about using JSON files or XML files using serialized. Well, the problem with doing that is as soon as you change any of your schemas, those all go out of date. You've got to regenerate them somehow. So we can do you migrate, you dump, copy the file, and whatever. The testing community is really pushing hard towards using a pattern of creating your test fixtures using code, like this. So you say, this is like based on the Django poll app, right? So get or create a poll with a test question, set some defaults, create some choices, and you can actually write a test that uses it to make sure it actually applies, and then your CI can run it every single time. Cool thing is you can actually create a syncdb hook to run that thing like a fixture. And so it'll run before your test run, it'll run every time you run syncdb, and you guarantee that stuff's in there and you've got code and it's tested. It's a pretty new pattern for us. So far it seems to be working pretty well. Something to think about. So this is a syncdb hook. That was one of the things. It's actually a little weird making syncdb hooks. The documentation is not very clear, but you got to send this parameter right here, the sender equal models, which is the models for the current app. That's how it filters who receives the hook. If you don't do that, it'll run it for every app. And if you're using South, you got to use a different hook. And it has different parameters. It takes an app name as a string. I don't know why these guys can't cooperate, but they don't. But so this is basically a pattern. Make your own little function. I put a verbose in there because then you can call it from a management command or something and spew. And then you've got one that eats a syncdb and one that eats a post migrate, and it works. Only kind of downside is if you're running tests, it actually calls this one on syncdb, then it flushes and calls this one again, and then it calls that one. So you're going to run it 3 times. So you want these to be fast, but price you pay. So finally, you got a Django application. You you thought about your settings, you thought about how you're going to handle your database. You got some fixtures in there, so you got development data. It doesn't require you to carry around these big DB dumps. How are you going to deploy this thing? So this is what Heroku basically, again, you get this for free with Heroku. So what are you going to do? You got to back up. You got to move your files somehow. So with Heroku they use Git, but then they actually package it all up, and they do probably this or this. I don't know how they move those bundles around. Then you got to update your database. So this is the risky part. And then you want to test your app ideally on the new environment against the same database as production. And then you want to flip-flop your traffic. And the reason you want to do that is so that you can roll back. Rollback's actually a really big deal. If you're looking at any kind of ops stuff, you don't want downtime. So the minute you detect a problem, you want a guaranteed rollback. Well, really the only way to do that is to have the old system still there. Because otherwise, you're relying on some guy to write. Who writes database migration, the backwards migration in itself? It's like, if it works automatically, great. Otherwise, well, I just deleted it. I swear, I've never seen somebody write a backwards migration, and when they try, they've never tested it. So if you could have those tested, then that'd be great. So in general, and to that point with the migrations, you're really going to need to actually, we actually flip our databases as well. We have two databases, so we make a new database over here, freeze the input on the other side, and then we drop the whole thing. I'd like to get to this, but I got to have a little more control over when migrations go. Yeah?
You run two databases on Heroku?
I don't use Heroku. We run our own stack. It's like everything you saw here we have. It's a HIPAA compliant app, and we get heavy like full body cavity inspections from Fortune 500s, and they come in, they want to know where everything is, where's our data. There's no way. Heroku just doesn't.
So this picture is for Heroku though?
Heroku basically is doing this for you. So this is your, what do they call it? This is your Postgres thingy on Heroku, whatever it's called. That's a dyno, that's a dyno. And when you do the deployment, literally they take this one online, they create a new one, they deploy your app into here, and then they flip the traffic over to that one.
What if the new one depends on model changes in the database?
So that's where you got a problem, and you have to actually test it. So that's something I'd love to talk about. How do you solve that problem reliably?
Yeah, David Kramer's done a couple of talks about work at Discus there, because they get some just completely ludicrous amount of traffic, and so their basic rule, it sounds like, is they only add things that are nullable, and then they basically clean up like a month later when they've migrated every instance of the old code in the world, and they know that there's no way they're
you're never going to want to roll back.
There.
I think I read a blog post about that.
Yeah, I mean, it's this sort of intricate dance you do so that, particularly because when you start talking like databases with replication, people do stuff like they have read slaves out here to make things faster. Well, great, the updates for these are not instantaneous, so it's entirely possible that you'll get something where the writes get farmed out to a thing which has been updated, and the reads are still going to something that's slightly stale, and you just are sort of stuck having to figure out what's an acceptable compromise. If it's healthcare records, we can't ever drop an update. If it's reading a forum post, maybe you say, we'll just throw an error and retry in 2 seconds.
Well, so for your use case, Heroku has snapshotting in their database. So I would just fire a snapshot before you do this. Hope it goes well, and if it doesn't, you roll back to the snap. And you can roll back to the dyno as well. And that's actually what we do. Our data set's small enough, and we're stopping input while we're updating, and we can roll back. But like discussion, you got lots of data. The only thing you can do is roll forward only, and you just. I'd be interested to know if they're actually testing that their new code or their old code is compatible with all new forwards migrations, because it should be possible to test that, but I don't know how.
I still get the impression that there's a bit of human review involved.
Yeah, that's in my mind, that's really the killer hard problem in doing all this stuff. The rest of this stuff you can knock out completely, but that one, the whole database migration thing is really killer.
This is a follow-up, and I think it's Heroku specific. So I know how I do that, but on Heroku, aren't you in control of the syncdb and migration commands from the Heroku tool belt? Or can you add that?
Yeah.
So what happens if I think the question was, if you have changes you push that say introduce a new table, the app goes live, do you then have to right away migrate? Or can you build that into automatically have the system do that? Because otherwise you have a potential maybe multiple seconds, maybe longer span where you get requests coming in and the table missing.
Right.
I wondered that too. Could you put it in a proc file or something for
You could do it
Heroku?
beforehand. You could
Yeah,
sync
well,
it.
that's
something
what
like that.
I think for a lot of those, you generally would have to do this first as a separate stage. So you're not talking one deploy, you're talking two, because unless you have a trivial amount of data, your migration may take a significant amount of
Yeah.
time to happen, and you just have to
You can do it in
figure
your
out
proc
what
file
you do.
too, right?
Yeah.
Because you
You
do that
can.
and you collect static in your proc file, and then you start your whiskey server.
You have to ensure that even when you do that, though, that the changes you deploy don't break something. You always want to keep basically your last known good one and then your current one. And especially with Heroku, because when you deploy, it's going to start over. So you can't say, hey, let me push this new, migrate, or push this new code and migration at the same time. Because you will have that moment. And that's fine for a lot of apps that are on Heroku. But the general best practice there that I've seen and done is your migration comes first. So you're like, hey, I'm going to be making a new model that uses this new table. Let me add this migration now. Push that, let that finish running, and then I'll push my code that uses that. And
I
also,
think that's the only way to really solve the problem. But the trick is you then have to make sure that it's not causing other problems.
So the interesting, so Etsy actually wrote an interesting blog post where, I mean, they do continuous deployment, and they do schema migrations once a week. So every time you write a piece of code, that code, you have to assume that's going to be delivered right away to a production environment. You have to have a feature flag to test whether you're actually going to be able, whether the database has been migrated or not. So that, it seems like maybe a different approach. Instead of migrating first, then your application logic becomes more complicated.
Right.
At least for that period of time that you know the schema migration may not have happened.
I mean, it's achieving the same end by putting the code out there but not running it. Which is, I mean, I'm a huge advocate for feature flags. Great idea to use them. And that's really great.
Pretty sure that was what Discus does. They actually wrote one of the Django gargoyles feature flipping library, and I think that's what part of what they were saying is like the migrations may go out well in advance of the flag being flipped, because that also it lets you verify that your migration doesn't break your old app unless you're doing some crazy non-reversible migration. That's the case, and then you can just enable the flag for like 1% of your traffic and see if smoke starts coming out, and then you're saying, okay, we flipped the code back, but we don't have to go reverse migrate 5 million records or something like that.
Yeah, that's a good point. I was saying it's hard to test. That sort of solves that problem because the old code is still there, and so you could write test cases, one with the feature flag on, one with it off. And they're always going to be running against the new tables.
And it just solves all the questions like, oh, was this always broken? And we've got the same instance running on another server, and it works there.
Yeah, cool stuff. So that's all I got. Ways you can contact me. Some stuff at GitHub. If you're interested in Puppet, I got a whole pile of Puppet recipes that have been purloined over from the net and then hacked at, mixed up between these two. Dex at SlideShare. You can connect to me on LinkedIn if you're into that kind of thing. Any other questions? Great. Thank you all.
I use your sheet actually.
Oh, it's just no. Do you need to be online?
Yep.
So we have to figure that problem out.
All right. Are you having any trouble getting on the wireless, or?
I just saw the sign. So I had the password, but I hadn't
Sunlight
actually
Rocks is the password.
Okay.
Sunlight Conference is the network.
Okay.
So.
I bet we can make it work.
And I almost want to ask everybody else to hold your requests for a second. I feel like it gets overheated really fast.
Need a browser?
Yep.
Cool. You're all set. Clickers right there if you want it. Yep.
All right. I was a little worried going last that there might be a lot of overlap, but I think there's just enough.
I'm going to click the allow box before it times out.
Thank you.
Sunlight Rocks all over
Good enough. Okay, so this talk is called Using Feature Boxes for Faster Development. Sort of a working title. You'll get the gist once I'm done. So, my name is Mike Waud. Unfortunately, my partner in crime, Erik Palakovich Carr, is really sick. He might be dying, we're not sure, but we thought it'd be best if he can come here and take out half the Django community and slow down development across the city. So we miss him, but he'll get better soon, we hope. And I think he's given a talk here about something like Django, so he should be a familiar face, I hope. And we are software developers at the Schroeder Institute at Legacy. And that's kind of a mouthful, but basically Legacy is a nonprofit that does anti-tobacco. You probably know them best from truth ads, where like body bags and all this terrible stuff with the tobacco companies. And inside this nonprofit, there's a research institute, which is a partnership between us and Georgetown and Hopkins. And we got some PhDs and some doctors, and we try and figure out, using technology, how can we fight these really huge budgets that the tobacco companies have with just a smaller budget. So fortunately, we can use Django for that. And as a nonprofit, we really appreciate all this free stuff that's out there. And whenever someone contributes to Django or writes a bug report, or even just does like a Stack Overflow comment, that helps us out. I'm sure it helps out everybody. So it's great to see open source sort of propagating throughout the community and eventually, hopefully, making someone's life better. So this is one of our apps. It's called Ubiquitous or Ubiquitous, and it's a Facebook app. And the idea is, first of all, social networking is very hot, so if you write a grant, it's probably going to get funded. But also, the way smokers are distributed, if you smoke, you're more likely to have friends that smoke. And if you don't smoke, your friends are less likely to smoke. So we're trying to target people who do smoke and then spread throughout their networks. So you can see, we got this kind of cute guy, and you can settle a quit date, you can invite friends. And we have a bunch of A/B testing so that we can tell which features are more successful and hopefully tailor a better intervention. Right now we have about 8,000 users, and it's the first ever evidence-based quit smoking Facebook app. So hopefully we get a lot of good data out of this and make our grant payers happy. It's built with Django, Celery, GitHub, Amazon RDS. We still use MySQL. And then we use Heroku and more Heroku add-ons than I can remember. These things are great. Once you use one, you want to use them all. Log entries, Loggly. Probably a topic for another talk, but if you go poke around, they got a lot of cool stuff. So that's our basic setup. And on to the talk. I'm going to talk a little bit about this kind of question mark where, on your when you're making something, you write your code, and then finally you deploy it to production. And there's a lot of talks about great libraries to use and cool tricks with Python. And there's also a lot of talks about how to deploy and how to scale. And once your code is there, what do you do? And there's this kind of question mark in between, and that's different for a lot of organizations. And I'm kind of interested in this question mark, and I think it's something that people don't talk about too much. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about what we've learned developing this, especially with, we sort of have a research view on this where the data is the most important. Fortunately, we don't have as many like HIPAA concerns, so we can use Heroku. But also, we don't want to expose ourselves to potential lawsuits, because if we say the wrong thing about tobacco companies, they could sue us. So that's also sort of a concern. So QA is a little bigger focus than maybe your average shop. So how we all started. I know this was me. Fire up your local development machine, open up Notebook or something, write some PHP or HTML, and then you FTP it to like your university server or GoDaddy website or something. And this is the dark ages, right? This is like curing a patient with leeches. So it's kind of fine for what it is, but hopefully we've all moved on to something a little better, because if you don't do that, you may say your code is tested, but really your users are the final testers. And they're either tell you a lot of problems, or they're not going to tell you anything because your site doesn't work, and you don't find out till much too late. So with that in mind, after the site's crashed a few times, you probably have a staging environment. Maybe you switch to Amazon. And this is good because if you don't commit a file, you're going to catch it on staging. And that alone would probably justify this setup to anybody. But it's also great because if your boss wants to check it out, he doesn't have to make sure your laptop is running, and he doesn't have to find out too late in production that it doesn't work. But this, still has a few more problems. So bosses have this magic skill of breaking your code just by looking at it, and I don't know how it does it, but my boss can do this pretty well. So with the staging environment, he might think some old, really stable code was on there, but you had just deployed something to test, and unfortunately he was on a call with a client or something, and they're looking at broken code. And if you have multiple developers, this gets even worse, because then you might be fighting for the staging environment. And back in the day, I remember this used to be a separate machine. That leads to this. So you want to avoid developer conflicts, of course, and it keeps everybody happy. So kind of my premise for all this is that testing should not be difficult. It should be easy, but more importantly, it should not be difficult. You shouldn't be using something that really causes you pain. If you can find a way to prevent that, it's going to pay off in the long term. Sometimes it's tough to convince people to make these investments in time or money, but for developer productivity, I definitely think it makes sense. Upcoming features should be viewable by others at any time. This is your QA people, clients, your boss. If you're out of the office, they shouldn't be counting on your local machine to be running. And this helps you too, because if it's running somewhere else, you can do whatever you want. You don't have to worry about your changes affecting them. Developers should also not compete for resources. It's like Heroku, this stuff is cheap. You can just throw up new ones at any time, new environments. And lastly, the testing environment should mirror production environment as closely as possible. This one's kind of well known now, and I think we touched on it in a couple of the talks earlier. You might have some library and it works great on your local machine, but it's got some bug with whatever memcache vendor you're working on, and you don't find it until way too late.
I got a question for you.
Yeah,
so
sure.
on Heroku, and this is one of the things I've sort of thought about is, again, testing should mirror production as closely as possible, but if your production is happens to be running, 10 dynos and a few workers, it's like, if you're just running 2 dynos and a couple workers or something like that, have you run into any issues?
Those concurrency issues are probably the toughest ones to debug, and I guess that's probably what I would lump that into. This doesn't solve that, but hopefully if you can reproduce it, then you can reproduce it locally, and your users won't see it. So it doesn't really
I
solve
meant
it.
more from the standpoint, like, if you're just doing, regular testing, okay, our latest code looks like it's good to go. Have you?
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if you've run into any problems where you're like, no, if you're using 6 dynos most of the time in production, use 6 dynos most of the time, and while you're doing the majority of your testing, or whether because those things are pretty much independent as far as web serving goes, that really haven't had any problems with that.
I haven't really seen it with dynos. We've had a lot of trouble with Celery,
Okay.
and that was like we have this visualization thing that uses just a ton of memory, and the workers were chewing up. One worker would have multiple Celery processes running, and it would chew up a lot of memory and not release it. So that was crashing. Unfortunately, we didn't really find a good way to fix that, regardless of the environment. But yeah, there is certainly stuff that you will catch too late.
One thing that is nice when you're talking any of these dynamic environments is you can scale things when you want to. So, like the classic thing: are you really looking for concurrency problems on every build? Probably not. Are you looking for this before you do a release? One thing I've done, I don't use Heroku for various reasons, but we're out in Amazon, so we can just spin up servers very quickly, and we're using Varnish on all of our servers. Varnish has this nice Varnish replay command, so you can go onto your production machine, say Varnish replay, pipe it at your staging servers, and all of a sudden you're feeding your full production load, which includes all the crazy stuff that the malware authors in Russia decided to send your way, all the weird requests where somebody's downloading an entire book or something from your site, and you can just do that for 30 minutes. Then you can say, okay, guess what? Staging goes back to being 1 or 2 boxes, and I spin it down, but for a period, you can do that measurement, and then you can actually do really nice things like saying, what was my average response time per view for production and staging? Did anything really jump dramatically one way or the other?
Sorry, so if you find like a bug on your production environment, just so if I get this straight,
Yeah.
you're like somebody made some request, and I don't know what it was. You can just like replay the last like.
Well, so varnish replay. So you can you could potentially do that if you caught it quickly enough. Varnish, basically, the way it logs everything is it stores it in a shared memory buffer of a certain size. So if it happened yesterday, you almost certainly wouldn't be able to do this. But if you were, say stress testing something and it broke right then, you might be able to. But basically, that's what the varnish replay thing does. Is it just reads this, and every time it finds a new message, it replays the same request with the same headers over to the other box.
That's pretty cool.
Which is really handy for this. The other thing I would plug is a completely unrelated distraction, but there's a great project called Sentry for doing full logging, getting full back traces, aggregating things so that you don't get a million emails if somebody requests a broken URL a million times, all of those sort of things. And that makes it a lot easier to say, okay, that thing that failed at 3 in the morning yesterday, what caused it? So back to the...
No, that's awesome. I would say, and if you're replaying your logs, make sure you are not connected to a live email server. That's really hang out with that.
All this little experience details.
Yeah, all the fun stuff. Okay. So yeah, those are kind of the ideas, basically. So we call these feature boxes. Some people call them sandboxes. Some people call them build servers, dev boxes, and then other people argue about, are you calling them the right things? So we just call them feature boxes. It's a name that stuck because with our development process, we're sort of developing features at a time. So basically, if you have one or more of these per developer, that'll cut down on sort of your deadlock. And these are something that typically live closer to the code, and it's not expected to be perfect, but it gives you an idea, and it's always great to just have an environment to throw stuff up on, and just send someone the URL or say, hey, go to featurebox A, check this out. It's very shareable. And then we still keep a staging environment, which has our dev branch, a lot more stable code, and the boss checks that out more often. So the pros and cons of this setup are that it really does encourage testing of features in isolation. Eric and I work on different things at once, so we'll have one thing on one box and another thing on another, and we actually have a QA person, sort of part-time, but then they have a pipeline of stuff that he will go through, and he'll look at box A or something, and he'll say, okay, it looks good here, and then we'll eventually do some integration testing on staging. And that way, it's not like someone's new button that they added broke my email feature that I was working on. It's just one less thing. Another pro is, like I said, it's always available, accessible by third parties. Sharing with the client, that's great. And with something like Heroku, and then with this, it's just like the best setup for matching your production environment and all the stuff you're running against. You certainly do still get sort of gotchas, but it's way minimized. And it's also good for teams that share code base, because you can just say, hey, am I crazy? I was thinking about doing it this way, here's how it runs. Or if you have you want to try and make your site purple, and you don't want to tie up staging with that, but you want to show everybody how cool it looks, you can just put it on this. And sort of one of the cons is cost, but you're really only paying per hour these days if you're using EC2. And with Heroku, like we saw, they'll spin it down. So if you're not using it, it shuts off. You don't even have to turn it off. So you're talking maybe an hour or two a day. And as far as developer productivity, it's way worth it. Before we switched to Heroku, we talked about hiring a sysadmin part-time or something. And now we don't even have that need. And I don't know about you guys, but finding a good sysadmin is tough because it's the most thankless job. So we're pretty happy about that. There's still some administration required. This can be minimized. Someone talked a little bit about environment variables, and we use that, for database passwords, all your sensitive settings. So once you get one of these up and running, it pretty much goes. But another thing is this isn't perfect for everybody, and it can be overkill for small or fast-moving projects. If you're making a website for your grandma's cats or something, you probably don't need this.
Oh, I have a question.
Sure.
Do you tend to have one feature box per developer or team that's working on a feature, just all the time, so that when your boss during lunch decides he needs to look at it, you don't have to set one up?
Yeah, definitely one per developer, and sometimes we'll have more than that. But in our ticketing system, when we're working on a ticket, we'll say, hey, this is on blah or something. So there's sort of a tie back to what's where. And I'll mention a little bit more of that in the next slide. Yeah. So tips and tricks. Sometimes developers are territorial, or if something's really bothering you, you can get grumpy. So we have like a naming scheme where like my name is Mike, so it's feature box M. Typically my stuff, what I'm working on, it's on feature box M. But if Erik needs to use it, he's welcome to use it. But he has his own feature box E. It's just these little sort of organizational tricks that you don't think about it, but it can actually really make a difference. Environment variables are your friend. It keeps all your sensitive stuff out of source code, which is very good. Another kind of cool trick is when you do your deploy with like Fabric or something, you can stick the Git branch and commit in the environment variables, and then like a context processor in Django, you can pull that out, and you can sort of hide it in HTML, and QA can say, hey, this specific build failed. And we also will tag some of our code in the database with which build it went on, so that if there's a problem with the data, we can track it back to which version was running it. And also, like we heard, the database schemas is kind of a headache. We haven't really solved that one, but whatever. 9 out of 10 ain't bad. So that's about it. Before I move on to questions, I will say we'll be at PyCon. Erik will be hopefully healthy by then. So poster sessions, come say hi. It's great to see DC people. And lastly, we are hiring. So feel free to either email me or contact me on the meetup. It's pretty awesome. We get like 4 weeks vacation or something. It's a great place to live. Yeah. Any more questions? You guys ready to get out of here? All right. Well, thanks.